She brought lawyers to my office while condolence flowers were still wilting on my desk. If you've ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or betrayed by family, don't look away. This story begins in silence, but it doesn't end that way. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stand up. I simply folded my hands, felt the weight of the envelope hidden in my drawer, and listened. I already knew this moment would come. I just hadn't expected her to be so quick. It was Tuesday, just after 10 in the morning. The sun slanted through the blinds in thin stripes, warming the stale smell of copier ink and old coffee. My black sweater still carried a faint trace of funeral incense. I hadn't bothered changing. Grief had a way of making clothing choices feel meaningless. The receptionist buzzed my phone. "Your sister is here," she said carefully, "with 4 attorneys." Before I could answer, the door opened. She walked in first, heels clicking too loudly for the size of the room, lips pressed into a practiced smile. The lawyers followed, briefcases tight in their hands, eyes already scanning my walls, my desk, my age. One of them looked younger than my grandson. Another smelled faintly of mint and impatience. "Well," my sister said, glancing at the flowers, "I see you've turned this into a shrine." I offered her a chair. My hand shook just enough that I noticed, then stilled. Years of motherhood, marriage, and loss had taught me how to steady myself in public. "We can make this quick," she continued, waving a folder like a flag of surrender she expected me to raise. Daddy wouldn't want delays. That word. Daddy. She hadn't used it in years. The men spread out without asking, one leaning against the filing cabinet, another placing papers directly over my notepad. No one asked how I was doing. No one mentioned the funeral. The flowers sat between us, petals browning at the edges. I poured tea from the small kettle I kept under my desk. Chamomile. My grandfather used to tease me about it, said it smelled like patience. The steam fogged my glasses, giving me a moment to breathe. "You're asking me to sign," I said calmly, adjusting the frames, "on the same day we buried him." Her smile sharpened. "I'm asking you to be reasonable." One lawyer slid a document toward me. I noticed his cufflinks were mismatched. Another detail filed away. Another quiet note. The paper trembled slightly as I picked it up. Not fear. Anger. Old anger, long managed, rising carefully. "You always were sentimental," my sister said. "That's why he trusted me with the practical matters." I looked at the signature line. My name typed neatly, waiting to be erased. Something in her tone felt rehearsed, too smooth, like a speech practiced in front of a mirror. She kept glancing at the clock, tapping one manicured nail against her folder. One of the lawyers avoided my eyes entirely. I thought of the night my grandfather handed me that envelope years ago. "Not yet," he'd said. "You'll know when." I sipped my tea. Too hot. It burned my tongue, grounding me in the moment. "You've brought a court with you," I said softly. "That seems excessive." She leaned forward. "Sign today or we let a judge decide." "I'm being generous." Generous. The word landed heavy in my chest. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and rang. The world continued, indifferent. I set the papers down carefully, aligning the edges. "I won't sign anything today." Her smile vanished. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. One lawyer cleared his throat. "You're making this difficult," she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "You don't have the resources for a fight." I met her eyes then, truly met them, and felt something settle inside me. Not courage. Certainty. I said, I replied evenly, "I won't sign today." Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel the envelope in the drawer beneath my hand, waiting. "Tomorrow morning," I added, standing at last. "Come back then." She stared at me, searching my face for weakness, for confusion, for the sister she remembered pushing around. Instead she found someone else. "Fine," she said finally. "Tomorrow." As they filed out, her shoulder brushed the doorframe just slightly. She didn't notice. I locked the door behind them and stood there, listening to my heart slow, knowing this was only the beginning. I stayed there a long moment after the lock clicked, my hand still resting on the door, listening to the quiet settle back into the office. By the time I got home, the sky had turned the dull gray of an early winter evening. My house smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner, the way it always did when no one had been there all day. I set my purse down, kicked off my shoes, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. The silence felt heavier than usual, like it was waiting for something. I knew what I had to do. I had known since the moment my sister said, "Tomorrow," with that sharp little smile. The envelope was exactly where I had left it, tucked into the back of a drawer I rarely opened. Yellowed at the edges. My name written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I sat at the kitchen table and ran my thumb along the crease before opening it, suddenly aware of how tired my hands felt. Inside were papers. More than I expected. Some typed. Some handwritten. All organized with the kind of quiet precision he'd always admired. A folded note sat on top. I unfolded it slowly. "If you're reading this," it began, "then things have gone the way I feared." My throat tightened. I let the words sit for a moment before continuing. He wrote plainly, without drama, explaining that he loved us both, but he had learned the hard way that love didn't always stop people from taking what wasn't theirs. He asked me to be patient, to read everything, to trust that he had thought this through. I turned the page. There were account summaries, dates circled in red ink, and short comments in the margins. Nothing screamed betrayal outright, but something about the pattern made my stomach turn. Withdrawals that didn't match expenses. Transfers timed too carefully to be accidental. I found myself holding my breath as I read, like I was afraid the truth might hear me. The phone rang sharp and sudden, and I nearly dropped the papers. It was my neighbor Carol calling to check in. She had brought over a casserole after the funeral and wanted to know if I'd eaten. "I'm fine," I told her, forcing a lightness into my voice. "Just a long day." "Well," she said gently, "don't stay up too late." After I hung up, I realized my hands were trembling again. Not with fear. With recognition. Pieces were sliding into place, slowly, painfully. I made myself a cup of tea and returned to the table. There was a legal document next, something about a trust. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know my name appeared more often than my sister's. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling both comforted and unsettled. He hadn't told me everything. That much was clear. But he had trusted me with enough. A soft knock came at the door. I froze, heart thudding, then exhaled when I saw it was my son holding a grocery bag. He took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I will be," I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. He made me promise to call if I needed anything and left just as quietly as he'd come. When the door closed, I felt strangely stronger, as if the house itself had steadied around me. I returned to the envelope, now empty, and the stack of papers spread across the table. There was more here than grief. More than inheritance. There was intention. Near the bottom I found a handwritten list. Names. A bank branch. An attorney I vaguely recognized from years ago. No explanations. Just breadcrumbs. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick. Tomorrow suddenly felt very close. I gathered the papers into neat piles, sliding them back into the envelope with care. I didn't know every move yet. I didn't need to. What I knew was this. My grandfather hadn't left me confusion. He'd left me a starting point. And as I turned off the kitchen light and headed down the hall, I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Resolve. Carried me through the night and into the pale gray of morning without sleep ever truly coming. I showered as the sky lightened, letting the water drum against my shoulders while my mind stayed sharp and alert. I chose a simple blouse, pressed slacks, shoes with steady heels. Nothing dramatic. I ate toast I barely tasted and watched the clock inch forward. My hands felt calm now, almost unfamiliar. When I picked up the envelope, it no longer felt heavy. It felt purposeful. The first call I made was to the number on my grandfather's handwritten list. A woman answered, her voice steady and warm, as if she had been expecting me. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. When I mentioned his name, she paused, then said softly, "Yes. We can speak today." Something loosened in my chest. The bank branch smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old paper. I sat across from a man who remembered my grandfather's habits better than my sister ever had. He spoke carefully, choosing words like stepping stones. I listened closely, asking questions I hadn't known how to ask the night before. Small confirmations came one by one. Dates aligned. Notes matched. Nothing explosive. Just enough. Outside, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. "Running late." Hope you're ready. I imagined her saying it aloud, chin lifted, already convinced of the outcome. I didn't reply. I stood for a moment in the parking lot, feeling the cool air against my face, grounding myself before driving on. Back at my office, the receptionist gave me a look that said she sensed a shift. I smiled at her, truly smiled, and asked for coffee. As I sat at my desk, I opened my calendar and canceled an afternoon appointment. Whatever today became, I needed space for it. I placed the envelope beside me, unopened now, no longer a mystery but not yet a weapon. A knock came earlier than expected. Not my sister. One of the lawyers from yesterday stood there alone, his tie loosened, his confidence thinned. He spoke politely, carefully, explaining there had been a development regarding representation. He didn't meet my eyes. When he left, I sat very still, letting the significance sink in without naming it. The room felt different with fewer voices. Quieter. Sharper. I poured myself water this time instead of tea. My reflection in the glass startled me. I looked older than yesterday. Not weaker. Clearer. I adjusted the stack of papers on my desk, aligning them just so, aware of the sound of footsteps approaching down the hall. She arrived with less flair than before. Same heels. Same folder. But something in her pace had changed. She glanced around as if expecting something to be missing. When she sat, she spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another, filling space that didn't need filling. I listened, nodding, letting her talk herself tired. When she finally stopped, I slid a single document across the desk. Nothing dramatic. Just paper. Her eyes flicked down, then up, then back again. The color drained from her face in slow degrees. She laughed once, sharp and short, and said my name like a warning. I folded my hands and met her stare, feeling steady, rooted, knowing the ground beneath her was no longer solid, and that she had just begun to realize it. I held her stare, feeling that quiet certainty settle deeper as she realized the ground beneath her was no longer solid. She straightened her folder and recovered quickly, anger flashing like a match struck too hard. "This doesn't change anything," she said, voice rising. "We'll go to court. You won't last a week." The words were sharp, familiar, meant to intimidate. I felt my shoulders tighten, then relax. I had lived long enough to recognize bluster for what it was. "I'm not afraid of court," I said, surprised by how steady I sounded. "I'm afraid of lies." I slid another paper forward, not the whole stack, just enough to shift the room again. One of the remaining lawyers cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more weight than her threat. She accused me of manipulation, of turning grief into leverage. I listened without interrupting, noticing how she avoided certain details, how her sentences rushed past specific dates. I remembered childhood arguments where she talked louder to win. The habit hadn't changed. The lawyer finally spoke, careful and precise, asking her to pause. He turned to me with a look that held both caution and curiosity. "We need to clarify a few matters," he said. I nodded. Clarification was something I could offer. As they reviewed the documents, the room filled with the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of office life outside. Phones rang. Printers whirred. Ordinary sounds continued while something extraordinary took shape between us. I felt a pulse in my ears, slow and controlled. She leaned toward me, lowering her voice. "You think he trusted you more?" she whispered. "You think you were special?" Her words cut close, not because they were true, but because they echoed old insecurities I had worked years to quiet. "I think he saw clearly," I replied. "And he planned accordingly." It wasn't the full truth. It was enough. The lawyer asked about a transfer I had seen the night before. A small amount, easily dismissed. My sister hesitated. Just a second. Long enough. I watched the moment pass across her face like a shadow. He noticed too. She snapped that it was irrelevant. He disagreed. Calmly. Professionally. The tone of the room shifted again, this time unmistakably. I felt my pulse slow further, my breath deepen. Anger still flickered, but it no longer led. Another document surfaced, then another. Not accusations. Questions. Each one narrowed the space she had to move. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, heels tapping against the chair leg. I recognized the signs. Pressure always revealed more than shouting. At one point she laughed, brittle and forced. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You don't even know what you're looking at." I met her gaze and said nothing. Silence, I had learned, made people fill it with truth. The lawyer requested a brief pause. He stepped aside to make a call, his voice low but urgent. My sister stared at the wall, jaw clenched. I felt an unexpected wave of sadness. Not for the estate. For us. For what we might have been. When the lawyer returned, he addressed us both, outlining options, consequences, next steps. His words were measured, neutral, but the weight of them landed harder on her side of the table. She bristled, then fell quiet. I realized then that this was no longer about winning. It was about being heard. About standing in the open with facts instead of fury. I straightened the papers before me, aligning corners, grounding myself in the small act. She finally looked at me, really looked, and for the first time her anger faltered. Something else flickered there. Doubt. Maybe even fear. I held her gaze, steady, knowing the truth didn't need my voice to speak for it. The room felt tighter, as if the walls had edged closer while no one was watching. I noticed a faint smell of dust from the vent, the dry scrape of winter air. My back ached from sitting so straight, but I didn't shift. I wanted her to see that I could hold this position as long as necessary. She muttered something about betrayal, about family, about fairness. None of it landed the way she intended. The lawyer asked her to focus, to answer directly. Each question peeled back another layer, not enough to expose everything but enough to make retreat impossible. I answered when asked, briefly, carefully, feeling the strange balance of restraint and strength settle into my bones. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. Anger had brought her here, but truth was keeping her seated. The clock ticked loudly now, marking time she could no longer control, while I sat quietly, present, letting every second confirm that patience had finally shifted the balance irrevocably. The lawyer closed his folder with a soft, final sound and looked at my sister, not unkindly but firmly. Given what's been presented, he said, we need to pause any immediate action. His eyes moved to me. You were right to wait. That was when it happened. The last piece slid into place, not with noise but with clarity. I reached into my bag and removed the final document my grandfather had left, the one I hadn't shown yet. Not a financial record. Not a trust amendment. A letter, notarized, written in his careful hand. I placed it on the table between us. My sister stared at it as if it might vanish if she didn't acknowledge it. He anticipated this, I said quietly. Not just the money. The moment. The letter explained everything he never said out loud. How he had watched patterns repeat. How he had forgiven small things until they grew too large to ignore. How he had chosen transparency over conflict. The estate was never meant to be divided by force. It was meant to be safeguarded. My sister's voice broke when she spoke. You planned this. No, I said. He did. I just listened. The lawyers exchanged looks. One nodded almost imperceptibly. The decision no longer belonged to argument or threat. It belonged to record. She slumped back in her chair, anger draining into something hollow. For the first time she looked older than me. Smaller. I felt no triumph in it. Just a quiet ending to something long unresolved. The settlement followed swiftly after that. No court. No spectacle. Agreements signed with shaking hands. Assets secured exactly as my grandfather intended. When it was over, the lawyers left us alone in the room, the door clicking shut behind them. She didn't look at me at first. When she finally did, her eyes were wet, but her pride kept the tears from falling. I didn't think you had it in you, she said. I stood, smoothing my jacket, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. Neither did you, I replied gently. I walked out of the office alone, the afternoon light warm on my face. The flowers were gone now, their place cleared. The hallway smelled of paper and possibility. I felt taller than I had in decades. At home that evening, I sat in my quiet kitchen and poured a cup of tea. The same chamomile. Tasted different now. Lighter. Earned. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone to boast. I opened the window and let the evening air move through the house, carrying away something old. I thought of my grandfather, of his patience, of the way he believed strength didn't need noise. I had kept the estate, yes. But what I walked away with was steadier than money. I had walked away with my voice, my ground, and the knowledge that silence, when chosen, can be the loudest form of justice. That night, for the first time in a long while, I slept without listening for footsteps. If this story spoke to you, you're not alone. Subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories about strength, betrayal, and the quiet kind of justice that changes lives.